Most people think wars are won by soldiers, by cannons, by strategies on battlefields. But the truth is far more shocking. Wars are won by money, not gold coins in a treasury, not silver in a chest, but by the invisible rules of credit, by global currency standards, by systems so powerful that they dictated victory before the first shot was fired. This is the story of the gold standard, the Manhattan Project of money, the system that shaped the 20th century's greatest wars. It controlled nations, it dictated economies, it decided who lived and who would struggle under debt. And few people realize that the entire world once operated on this invisible financial battlefield. The gold standard was not invented overnight, it evolved over centuries. Gold has always been valuable because humans trusted it, kings trusted it, merchants trusted it. By the 19th century, gold became more than just a metal. It became a global promise, guarantee of value. Every pound, franc, or dollar tied to gold carried trust, and trust was the most powerful weapon of all. Britain was the first to weaponize it. The British pound was convertible to gold at a fixed rate. This meant that foreign governments and merchants trusted British currency implicitly. London became the world's financial nerve center. But gold alone could not conquer empires. It needed credit. The combination of gold and credit created unstoppable power. Britain could fight wars without immediate resources. It could borrow against future production. It could leverage credit to fund armies, navies, and colonial expansion. Every war became a calculated financial operation, and every victory depended on sustaining the flow of money. Other nations tried to compete. France had armies, but their treasury was limited. Germany industrialized rapidly, but lacked the global trust that gold-backed Britain commanded. And when wars came, those limits were fatal. By the time Napoleon rose to power, Britain had perfected a system of financing wars that could outlast armies and outlast time itself. The gold standard was not just money, it was a framework. It dictated who could borrow, who could trade, who could survive economically during conflict. And those who failed to comply with its rules were forced to surrender. Debt, liquidity, and currency stability became as lethal as bullets. When World War I erupted in 1914, the world was already running on the gold standard. Britain, Germany, France, and the United States had currencies pegged to gold. Every bank, every merchant, every government had to maintain gold reserves. Money was a weapon. Every gold reserve dictated who could wage war. France and Germany mobilized millions of soldiers. But soldiers alone could not fight the financial war. The real battle was maintaining liquidity, paying armies, buying supplies, sustaining industrial output. Nations that exhausted their gold reserves faced immediate collapse. France ran low. Germany's access to gold was cut by blockades. Britain leveraged global credit to maintain its position. It borrowed from banks, it borrowed from colonies. It leveraged the trust of its empire, and the world was watching. Every battle on the Western Front had a shadow in London's financial districts. The flow of gold determined who could continue fighting, who had to surrender, and who would negotiate peace. By the end of the war, the gold standard had dictated economic collapse and hyperinflation in Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was less about diplomacy and more about finance. Reparations, loans, and gold reserves determined Germany's fate. The financial battlefield had already won. After World War I, Europe was devastated. Countries struggled to rebuild. The gold standard was restored in many places, but it was fragile. Britain returned the pound to gold at pre-war parity. Exports became expensive. Factories struggled. Unemployment soared. Germany tried to pay reparations in gold. Its economy collapsed. Inflation soared. Money became worthless. People lost faith in currency. And the stage for World War II was set, not with tanks, but with debt and monetary failure. Credit had failed nations. Gold had failed nations. But the structure of finance remained central to power. America, which had not yet fully embraced global finance, began to emerge as a new center. By lending to Europe, the U.S. dictated recovery. By controlling liquidity, the U.S. became the ultimate arbiter of war financing. Gold remained a symbol, but control over credit became the real weapon. Nations without access to global credit networks became vulnerable, and those with access flourished. The gold standard had shown the world one fundamental truth: wars can be won, not on the battlefield, but in banks and balance sheets. When World War II began, the lessons of gold were already clear. Germany tried to manipulate currency. Italy tried to mobilize without sufficient liquidity. Britain relied heavily on credit. It borrowed from allies. It borrowed from colonies. It issued war bonds to citizens. Every pound was tracked, monitored, and leveraged. America emerged as the central banker. Lend-Lease wasn't just aid. It was a financial strategy. By providing credit to Britain and its allies, the U.S. effectively controlled production, supply lines, and strategic outcomes. Gold played a smaller role. Credit and liquidity dominated. Wars were now financial operations on a global scale. Those who controlled cash flow controlled the outcome. Soldiers could march, but only if bankers approved the funding. Every tank, every bullet, every ration was financed before it reached the front. And the nations that mismanaged money mismanaged power. Germany ran short, Japan ran short, Italy ran short, Britain survived, because finance had become the ultimate weapon. When World War II ended, most nations were destroyed. Cities were rubble, factories were silent, key infrastructure was broken, armies could no longer march, but money could still move. And whoever controlled the money would control the world that came next. For the first time in history, one nation held nearly all the world's financial leverage. That nation was the United States. America had industrial power. It had oil. It had factories untouched by bombing. But most importantly, it had gold. By 1945, America controlled roughly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. This wasn't an accident. It was a financial victory. While other nations spent, America lent. While other nations borrowed, America collected. Credit financing had won the war as surely as armies had. And now, the post-war world had to be redesigned. But redesigned by whom? By soldiers? By generals? By politicians? No, it was redesigned by economists, by central bankers, by treasury officials. The true architects of modern power. Their project began at Bretton Woods. In a quiet room in New Hampshire, in 1944, they drafted a new financial order. 70+ nations agreed to it, but only one nation would dominate it. Under Bretton Woods, currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold. But no nation could redeem gold directly anymore. Only central banks could. This was a revolution. It meant that gold was no longer money for people. It was money for governments. The US didn't need to conquer Europe or Asia. It conquered the global financial system instead. Britain had once used the gold standard to rule the seas. America used Bretton Woods to rule the world economy. Gold became the silent referee of nations, but it didn't last forever. As Europe rebuilt and Japan industrialized, a problem emerged. Foreign nations demanded dollars. They needed dollars to trade. They needed dollars to buy oil. They needed dollars to pay debts. But the US printed more dollars than it had gold to back them. The math didn't balance. The promise had been broken. In 1971, the world faced a moment of truth. President Nixon shocked the planet. He closed the gold window. From that moment forward, the dollar was no longer tied to gold. It floated freely, and the gold standard died. But the system didn't collapse. It transformed. The world entered a new era. The era of fiat money. Money no longer needed gold. It needed belief. It needed credit. It needed confidence. The gold standard had proven one thing: money was power. Now the question became, who controlled money without gold? The answer was simple. Central banks, governments, bond markets, debt became the new weapon. Credit became the new battlefield. And inflation became the new taxes. Wars no longer required trenches. They required liquidity. Nations no longer needed colonies. They needed capital flows. The gold standard had shaped wars, but fiat money shaped peace. A new empire emerged. It was invisible. It had no borders, no armies, no flags. It lived in banks, markets, and spreadsheets. And yet, It controlled the fate of nations more effectively than any empire in history. Today, when governments collapse under debt, when currencies inflate, when markets panic, when investors move billions with a single click, that is the legacy of the gold standard. It taught the world that finance could decide victory. It taught the world that trust was currency. It taught the world that money was power, and the people who understood it dominated those who didn't. The gold standard may be gone, but its fingerprints remain everywhere. On central banks, on exchange rates, on global trade, on geopolitics, on the modern world itself. History remembers generals and armies, but history was written by bankers. The Manhattan Project of money changed wars, and then it changed the world. If you want to hear more stories about how money shapes power, and how finance builds and destroys empires, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because the world you live in is not controlled by politics, it is controlled by money. And money has a history deeper and darker than most people can imagine.